Out of the dense mist, a little girl ran, her screams about her mother hanging from a tree, shattering the silence and halting a convoy of imposing black cars. She had no idea she was flagging down Ramon Ortega, a man whose name was synonymous with ruthless power. But real power exists to protect the weak. Instead of moving on, he led his armed crew into the woods to free the woman. The monsters who did this to her family are about to discover that a new predator now rules this forest. If this story has captured your attention, you need to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. I have another incredible story ready for you tomorrow. Before we continue, drop a comment and let me know what city you're tuning in from. I am always amazed to see how far our community reaches. This story will show you that real power is not measured by how many people fear you, but by who you choose to protect when no one is watching. Sometimes the most unexpected person becomes the hero, and one moment of courage from the smallest voice can change everything. Now, let's dive back in. The fog crept in that morning, clinging low to the ground and spilling over the forest road with a mind of its own. It devoured the asphalt in a thick gray tide, silencing the world and reducing the great pines to towering, watchful shadows. They could have been judges, or they could have been asleep. A chill was in the air, a cold that carried the scent of wet soil and moss and burned in your lungs with every breath. The world was still. The world was quiet. And then she appeared. The child seemed to emerge from the very substance of the fog, a spirit taking on flesh. Her dress, once the color of a soft rose, was ripped and smeared with grime that looked black in the muted light. She was running barefoot down the middle of the road, her small arms pumping with a frantic energy, each breath a painful, tearing sound from deep inside her. This was not a game. This was not a race. This was a flight for survival. Her bare feet made a slapping sound on the wet road, leaving behind faint, bloody marks that the mist quickly erased. Her dark hair was a tangled mess across her face, and when she tripped, she caught herself on shaking hands before forcing her exhausted body upright again. The impact of her fall echoed like a gunshot in the profound stillness. She kept running until she saw them. Two black sedans sat parked across the road, their engines humming with a low, expensive growl. They formed a complete blockade, as if they were lying in wait for a specific target. Polished chrome cut through the fog, and the dark-tinted windows showed only a reflection of the endless gray. The vehicles themselves looked as though they were crafted from darkness and cold steel. The little girl never broke her stride. She ran directly at the cars, her small voice tearing the morning apart. "Help me!" The plea was ripped from her throat, a sound of pure desperation. "Please, somebody has to help!" The driver's door of the front car swung open. A man emerged with the slow, deliberate confidence of someone who commanded his world. He was tall and broad, dressed in a black suit over a black shirt, with no tie. His jacket was unbuttoned, showing a canvas of intricate tattoos that covered his chest and snaked up his neck in a tapestry of symbols and scripts, telling stories that polite society never hears. More ink marked the backs of both his hands, dark and visible even from a distance. His dark hair was combed straight back from a face that was a mask of cold composure. He projected a kind of danger that expensive, powerful things often do. His name was Ramon Ortega, and in the world he inhabited, that name was heavy enough to break people. As he stood, two more doors opened with a smooth, synchronized quiet. Three other men got out, all in dark suits with white shirts and ties, all moving with the same focused economy of motion. They instinctively created a defensive perimeter, their hands held close to the weapons hidden under their jackets, their eyes scanning the fog-shrouded trees with the constant alertness of trained soldiers. These men were not just bodyguards, they were instruments of Ramon's authority. The girl finally reached Ramon, but her legs gave out. She collapsed onto her knees just a few feet from his gleaming shoes, sending a spray of muddy water across the asphalt. She stretched her hands toward him, her fingers bent like claws. "They hung my mom from a tree," she cried, the words tumbling from her in a rush of panicked breaths. Please, you have to go save her. Please. Ramon looked down at the child on the ground, his expression a perfect blank. He did not bend down, he did not offer a hand. He simply observed her, his dark eyes taking in every detail. He saw the raw, red welts left by ropes around her small wrists, cruel makeshift bracelets. He saw how her entire frame trembled from a combination of terror and sheer exhaustion. And he saw the dirt packed beneath her fingernails from when she must have clawed at the ground, or at her captors. One of his men took a half step forward. Boss? Ramon simply raised a single hand, and the man fell silent immediately. Only the little girl's desperate, shattered sobs filled the heavy air. Please, she whispered, her voice failing her. She is still back there. They left her up there hanging. Please. Ramon tilted his head, his focus entirely on her, his mind analyzing, processing. The child was not merely frightened, she was deeply traumatized. He had seen enough of both states to recognize the vast difference. Where? His voice was low and calm, completely devoid of any emotion. The girl raised a trembling arm and pointed into the woods, toward a solid wall of trees that vanished into the thick, unmoving fog. In there, she said. It is not far. I ran. I just ran as fast as I could. Her voice finally gave out completely. She folded in on herself, pressing her dirty forehead to the cold, wet road. Ramon shot a look at his men. No command was given. None was required. The engines were cut, one after another. The car doors shut with quiet, definitive clicks. The three men fell into a protective formation around Ramon without a single word of instruction, their hands now resting plainly on the firearms beneath their suits. Ramon looked back down at the collapsed child. Get up! The little girl pushed herself to her feet, swaying unsteadily. Ramon reached out and caught her by the elbow, his grip neither gentle nor harsh, but firm enough to steady her. She gazed up at him, her eyes wide and bloodshot, filled with more desperate hope than any child should ever have to place in a stranger, particularly a man like him. You will lead us, Ramon stated plainly. We will follow. The girl gave a series of frantic nods and immediately turned toward the forest. She managed only 3 steps before her legs folded beneath her again. This time Ramon did not hesitate. He scooped her up in one smooth motion, placing her on his hip with one arm. She felt as if she weighed nothing at all. Hold on, he said. It was not a request, it was a directive. She instantly wrapped her small arms around his neck, hiding her face against the fabric of his shoulder. He could feel her tears soaking into his very expensive suit, but he gave it no mind. Ramon started toward the edge of the woods, his men moving into a tactical diamond around him, one man taking point, the other 2 covering the flanks. They walked into the forest and were immediately consumed by the fog and the deep shadows. The path the girl guided them along was barely a trail at all, something made by animals rather than people. Low branches reached out like claws, snagging at their suits. Exposed roots coiled across the path, trying to trip them. The mist seemed to grow even thicker, pressing in around them like a living, breathing entity. The air temperature dropped a full 10 degrees in just a few yards. Ramon could feel the child's tiny heart hammering against his ribs, a wild, frantic beat that seemed to match the growing menace in the air. His men moved with absolute silence, their weapons now in their hands, their senses on high alert. This feeling was familiar to them. They had walked into traps many times before, yet this felt different. This place felt heavier, fundamentally wrong. The forest then parted without warning, the trees receding as if they were curtains being pulled back to reveal a gruesome stage. A clearing opened before them, perfectly circular and unnervingly barren. In the very center of this clearing stood a gigantic oak tree, its ancient twisted branches spreading wide like arms of judgment. Dangling from one of those thick branches, turning ever so slightly in a breeze that only existed in that one spot, was a woman. "Mama!" the little girl shrieked. Ramon's face remained a stone mask, but his grip on the child tightened, and his free hand moved to the weapon at his side. "Check on her," he ordered in a low voice. One of his men broke from formation and ran forward. The man who got to Elena Smith first was named Victor. He was a former Special Forces soldier whose hands were accustomed to unimaginable violence. Yet as he placed 2 fingers on the side of the woman's neck, feeling for a heartbeat beneath the cold skin, those same hardened hands shook. "She is alive!" he shouted back, his voice strained. Ramon did not allow himself the luxury of relief. Relief was a weakness. Action was strength. He carefully turned Maria in his arms, positioning her so she could no longer see her mother hanging helplessly from the thick rope. "Do not look," he said, his voice quiet. The words were not meant as comfort. They were a direct command. Maria pressed her face hard into his shoulder, her tiny body racked with silent, exhausted sobs. She had no more screams left inside her. Ramon's other 2 men acted with swift, practiced efficiency. One of them, Diego, drew a combat knife from his belt and started to climb the huge tree, moving with the skill of a man who had faced far greater obstacles. The other man, Mateo, positioned himself directly under Elena, his arms up and ready to absorb her full weight as soon as the rope was severed. Ramon stood back and watched them, his thoughts already moving far ahead of the present moment. Whoever had done this was not long gone. The raw rope burns on Maria's wrists proved that she had been tied up. The fresh mud caking her dress showed she had fallen repeatedly during her desperate escape. The pure terror in her eyes told him that the men who had hung her mother were the type to make brutal examples, not to issue empty warnings. They were still somewhere nearby. He was sure of it. "How long?" Ramon asked Maria, his voice low and even, cutting through her sobs. The little girl pulled her head back slightly, her tear-streaked face showing confusion. "What? How long ago did they leave this place?" Maria's eyes lost focus as she tried to make sense of time through the fog of her trauma. I do not know. It was not long, maybe. Maybe they are still—" Her voice broke apart. "They said they would be back. They said if anyone came to help, they would—" "They are not coming back," Ramon cut her off, his tone leaving no room for argument. It was a flat and absolute declaration. He offered no explanation because none was needed. High above them, Diego's sharp knife sliced through the last fibers of the thick rope. "Ready," he called down to Mateo. "Now." The rope split with a sound like a final, weary sigh. Elena's body fell into the waiting arms below. And with a surprising gentleness, Mateo intercepted her fall, lowering her carefully onto the wet earth. Victor was at her side in an instant, his hands moving with the precision of a surgeon as he assessed the damage, checking her vital signs. It was a skill that seemed out of place for a man whose expertise was in causing injury, not mending it. "Her pulse is faint, but it is holding steady," Victor announced, his fingers shifting from her throat to her wrists. He examined the raw, deep grooves the ropes had gouged into her skin. "She is probably hypothermic, definitely in shock. We need to get her to a hospital." "No hospitals," Ramon declared without hesitation. The 3 men turned to look at him. They were trained not to question orders, but their shared silence was a question in itself. Ramon gently set Maria down, but he kept a hand on her small shoulder to keep her steady. The little girl tried to dart toward her mother, but he held her in place with a quiet strength. "Not right now. You need to let them work. But she is alive because we arrived when we did, and she will stay alive if you allow my men to help her." Ramon's intense dark eyes locked with the child's. "You can trust me, or you can run. But if you decide to trust me, you must listen to what I say." Maria swallowed, the sound loud in the quiet clearing, and gave a sharp nod. Her little hand clutched the fabric of Ramon's jacket with a grip so fierce her knuckles turned white. With his other hand, Ramon retrieved his phone, dialing a number from memory without even glancing at the screen. The call was answered on the first ring. "I require a full medical team," he stated, his voice sharp and devoid of emotion. The patient is a woman, mid-30s, suffering from exposure, severe ligature marks, significant trauma, and likely shock. I am at a discreet location. Be there in 20 minutes. He fell silent, listening to the person on the other end. No, not the clinic. Send them to the safe house over on Riverside. He terminated the call and slid the phone back into his pocket, his focus returning entirely to his men. Diego had already climbed down from the tree and was now scanning the area with the intense focus of a hunter, reading the forest floor as if it were a detailed map written in upturned leaves and snapped twigs. "Boss," he said in a low voice, "we have fresh tracks here. I see 3, possibly 4 individuals, wearing heavy boots. They were heading northeast." Ramon's jaw tightened, a barely perceptible motion. "How recent?" Diego knelt down, gently touching the rim of a boot print left in the soft ground. "Only minutes ago. They could still be within a quarter of a mile from here." The entire atmosphere in the clearing shifted. The energy changed from a rescue mission to something much colder, much sharper. It was a feeling all 3 men recognized better than any other. Ramon glanced down at Maria. "What is your mother's name?" "Elena," Maria whispered. "Her name is Elena Smith. Elena is going to be all right. My men are going to take excellent care of her. But I need you to remain here with Victor while we take care of something." "No!" Maria's grasp on his jacket grew frantic. "Please do not leave me alone. They said they would come back for me." "They will not be coming back," Ramon said again. But this time, his voice carried a tone that made the promise sound like a death sentence for someone else. "I am going to personally ensure that." He gently uncurled Maria's fingers from his jacket and guided her toward Victor, who had already taken off his suit coat and draped it over Elena's still body. "Stay right here with your mother," Ramon told her. "Victor will make sure you are both safe, and if anyone approaches who is not one of us, he will take care of the problem." Victor met Ramon's gaze and gave a single firm nod. His hand drifted down to rest on the firearm hidden beneath his shirt. Ramon then turned to Diego and Mateo. Not a single word was spoken between them. None was required. The 3 men moved like a single entity, heading down the northeast trail. They left Victor kneeling between Maria and her mother, a guardian angel dressed in a suit and carrying a gun. Maria watched them vanish into the thick fog, her voice a fragile whisper. "Where did he go?" Victor checked Elena's pulse one more time, his face carefully blank. He went to deliver a message. What kind of a message? Victor was silent for a long moment, his senses tuned to the sounds of the forest. Far away, through the dense mist and the ancient trees, he thought he heard the sound of shouting, which was quickly followed by silence. "The permanent kind," he finally answered. Maria did not understand, not completely, but as she curled up next to her mother's unconscious body, feeling the shallow rise and fall of Elena's chest, a part of her understood. It was the part of her that had run barefoot through a living nightmare and had somehow, impossibly, found the exact right dangerous man to trust. She understood just enough. The forest had swallowed Ramon Ortega and his men whole, as if they had never been there at all, but the forest would not forget what happened next. Victor got to work in silence, his hands moving with practiced skill over Elena's cold form. He had seen far worse things, much worse, but there was something about finding a woman suspended from a tree like a macabre warning that made his jaw clench with a particular anger. Maria sat huddled against his side, her pale rose dress stained with mud and damp from the morning mist. Her eyes were fixed on her mother's face. Elena's skin had turned a pale, grayish color, making her look more like a ghost than a living person. Her breathing was shallow and uneven, a pattern that made Victor deeply uneasy. "Is she going to wake up soon?" Maria's voice was tiny, almost gone, worn raw from hours of screaming. Victor took a tactical blanket from the pack he never went anywhere without, and gently spread it over and gently arranged it over Elena's shoulders. "She's going to be all right, But not right away. Her body basically shut down to shield itself from more trauma. It's working to repair the damage. What kind of damage? Victor paused, searching for the right words. How could he possibly explain to a little girl what it feels like to be suspended from a tree by your wrists for hours? He couldn't describe the way your blood stops flowing, how every muscle fiber ignites with pain, or how the mind begins to splinter under that relentless agony. From being terrified for a very, very long time, he said at last. Maria gave a slow, deliberate nod. She accepted his words because she now understood terror on a fundamental level. She had been trapped inside that feeling for what seemed like a lifetime. But why did they do that? She asked in a small voice. My mom never hurt anyone. All she does is work at the diner. She takes me to school and she reads me stories before I sleep. Her voice trembled and broke. Why would anyone hang her from a tree like that? Victor had no simple answer for that question. From his experience, malice didn't need a reason. Some men simply took pleasure in exercising their power over those who were defenseless. But he couldn't voice that truth to a child whose entire world had just been violently torn apart. Some people are broken on the inside, he offered instead. And people who are broken tend to break other things. Maria considered this, her small hands nervously twisting the thick wool of his suit jacket that covered her mother. Is Mr. Ortega broken? The question, so much more insightful than he had anticipated, made Victor raise his eyebrows. Why would you ask that? Because he never smiled, not for a single second, and his eyes… Maria paused, struggling to articulate what she saw. They just looked so empty, like there was nobody home inside. Victor reached down and checked Elena's pulse again. It was still faint, but it was there. He thought about how to answer. Ramon Ortega was a great many things. He was dangerous, he was powerful, and he was utterly ruthless when the situation called for it. But broken? That was far more complicated. Mr. Ortega is not empty, Victor explained carefully. He is watchful. He has witnessed many terrible things, and he has done whatever was necessary to get through them. An experience like that changes a person. Did it change you too? Victor looked into the little girl's eyes and saw a sharp intelligence there, something that had been forged by survival. This was not a polite question. She truly wanted to understand the men who had appeared out of the fog to save her mother. Yes, he admitted quietly, it did. But you still helped us. Yes, we did. So maybe Mr. Ortega is not broken. Maybe he is just… Maria looked for the word again. Careful. Just like you said. A smile almost formed on Victor's face. Almost. Perhaps. A sound suddenly sliced through the forest's quiet. It was distant, but clear. A man shouted. Then another shout followed, and the unmistakable crack of something that could have been a large branch snapping, or it could have been something else entirely. Maria went rigid, her hand flying out to grab Victor's arm. What was that sound? That was Ramon, Victor said with certainty. His hand moved to rest on his weapon, but he did not draw it. Not yet. His eyes swept the tree line, taking note of every shadow, every slight movement in the fog. Is he going to be okay? He is perfectly fine. How can you be so sure? Because if he was not, we would be hearing a whole lot more noise. Another sound drifted through the trees toward them. This time it was clearly a voice, raised in what sounded like pain or terror, and then it was abruptly cut off. Silence flooded back into the clearing, like water filling a hole. Maria's breathing grew faster. They are hurting someone, are they not? Yes. The men who hurt my mom? Yes. Maria was silent for a very long time, letting this new information sink in. Victor anticipated tears, or maybe fear, or even some kind of confusion about responding to violence with more violence. Instead, the little girl's voice was cold and flat, in a way that made her sound much older than she was. Good. Victor glanced down at her, startled by the hard steel he heard in that single word. Maria stared into the fog, in the direction where Ramon and the other men had disappeared. Her jaw was set, and her eyes were like chips of ice. They hung my mom from a tree as if she was nothing, as if she was garbage. Maria went on, her voice starting to shake, not with fear, but with a building rage. They tied me up so I would have to watch, and they were laughing. One of them said, she stopped, forcing herself to swallow. He told me that nobody would ever care about us, that people like us just do not matter. Victor's hand tightened on the grip of his weapon. What else did you hear them say? Maria just shook her head. I cannot remember everything. There were 4 of them. They had masks on, but their eyes were showing. One of them had a tattoo right on his hand, a snake that was eating its own tail. Another one smelled like old cigarettes and something too sweet, like cheap cologne. Victor mentally recorded these details. Ramon would want them later if there was anything left of the men to identify. They told me they would come back tomorrow, just to check on things, Maria whispered. They said it like it was some kind of joke, like finding my mom hanging there was funny to them. They will not be coming back, Victor said. And there was a finality in his tone that even a small child could recognize as an unbreakable promise. Because of Mr. Ortega. Yes, because of Mr. Ortega. Maria looked back down at her mother's still body, at the shallow movement of her chest, and at the angry, raw rope burns that circled her wrists like permanent scars. She then raised her head, looking at Victor with eyes that seemed to have aged 10 years in just a few hours. I am so glad I ran to him for help, she said in a low voice. I am glad I did not run away. Your mother is too, Victor assured her, even if she cannot know it right now. All around them the forest had fallen completely still. There were no birds chirping, no rustle of wind in the trees, no human voices. There was only the thick, waiting silence of a place that had just witnessed something final and irreversible. Victor looked at his watch. It had been 15 minutes since Ramon had departed. The medical support was due to arrive in 5. Elena was going to make it. Maria was going to make it. And somewhere deep in that heavy fog, 4 men were discovering the true price of their cruelty. The sound of an engine suddenly sliced through the forest's quiet. It was a low, powerful, and deliberate rumble. Victor's head shot up, his hand instinctively moving to the weapon in his holster before he identified the unique sound of Ramon's Mercedes making its way down the narrow dirt path. Stay right here, he commanded Maria, moving to stand between her and the approaching car. However, it was Ramon who appeared out of the fog first, walking steadily in front of the vehicle as it crawled slowly behind him. His black suit was immaculate, save for a few stray leaves that had settled on his shoulders. His face was as unreadable as it had always been. But Victor, having worked alongside him for 7 years, saw the faint tightness around his jaw and the paleness of his knuckles. Diego was behind the wheel, with Mateo in the passenger seat beside him. Both of their faces looked as if they were carved from solid stone. Ramon's gaze immediately found Elena's still form, then moved to Maria, and finally to Victor. She is stable, but her condition is critical, Victor reported. Her pulse is getting stronger. I see no indication of internal damage, but she urgently needs professional medical care. Her body temperature is dropping. Ramon gave a single, sharp nod, then knelt down beside Maria. The little girl looked up at him with enormous eyes, searching his expression for something she could not name. Answers, comfort, a confirmation of the sounds she had heard from far away. Your mother is being taken to a secure location, Ramon said, his voice quiet yet perfectly clear. A team of doctors is waiting to care for her. You will be able to stay with her for the whole time. What happened to those men? Maria whispered. Ramon met her stare directly. They will never bother anyone ever again. There was something in the simplicity of his words, a cold and absolute finality that made Maria's small shoulders visibly relax, as though a terrible weight had finally been lifted from them. She did not ask for details. She did not ask what had taken place. Some truths do not require any explanation. Thank you, she whispered, the words barely audible. Ramon stood up without acknowledging her gratitude, already turning to help Victor lift Elena. They moved with a practiced, synchronized quiet. Ramon supported her head and shoulders while Victor took her legs, and together they gently transferred her into the back of the Mercedes. Diego had already unfolded several more blankets over the leather seat, creating a makeshift gurney. Maria, get inside, Ramon directed, holding the door for her. The girl quickly scrambled into the car, immediately taking a spot next to her mother and wrapping one small hand around Elena's icy fingers. Ramon followed her in, his large body taking up the rest of the space. Victor got into the front passenger seat, as Diego remained in the driver's position. Go, Ramon ordered simply. The Mercedes moved in reverse with incredible agility, navigating the tight trail as Diego's hands remained perfectly steady on the steering wheel despite the challenging ground. Tree branches scraped against the windows, like long, bony fingers trying to pull them back into the woods. The fog was a thick wall, making it almost impossible to see more than 10 feet in any direction. But Diego had navigated worse roads in far worse conditions. His focus never wavered from the path. In the back, Ramon was monitoring Elena's breathing, his fingertips resting lightly on the inside of her wrist, tracking her pulse. It was weak, but it was there, and it was steady. The human body had a remarkable capacity for survival, if only it was given a chance. Maria observed him with an intensity that would have been unsettling if Ramon were a man who cared about being comfortable. "Are you a doctor?" she asked him. "No. But I have seen enough wounds to recognize when a person is going to survive them." "And my mom is going to survive?" Ramon's dark eyes met hers across the back seat. "Yes." The profound certainty contained in that one word seemed to stabilize something deep inside Maria. Her tight grip on her mother's hand relaxed just a little. The sheer panic that had been fueling her for hours finally started to fade away. The Mercedes finally broke out of the forest path and onto the paved main road, accelerating with smooth and instant power. The fog began to thin as they put distance between themselves and the woods, and weak morning sunlight tried to push through the gray clouds above. "Estimated time of arrival?" Ramon asked. 12 minutes, Diego answered, his foot pressing down more firmly on the gas pedal. The needle on the speedometer climbed higher. Victor took out his phone and typed a rapid message. "Torres has confirmed the medical staff is on standby. A surgical suite is prepped just in case. They have a matching blood supply ready." "Good." Maria's head turned back and forth between the men, taking in the incredible efficiency of their communication and the seamless way they operated like components of a single, well-oiled machine. "Where are we going?" "You mentioned it wasn't a hospital." "We are going somewhere much safer," Ramon answered. "A place where the men who hurt your mother have no influence, no contacts, and absolutely no way to complete what they started." "But they—" Maria stopped, looking back toward the forest that was now vanishing behind them. "They are not going to be finishing anything, are they?" "No." The word was absolute, hanging in the air with the finality of a slamming prison door. The Mercedes devoured the miles, its advanced suspension system absorbing every imperfection in the road that would have shaken a lesser car. In the back, Elena's breathing started to become a little deeper, her body's survival instincts finally taking over now that she was warm, lying down, and out of immediate danger. "She moved," Maria said suddenly, her voice sharp with excitement. "Her fingers, I felt her fingers move." Victor turned around in his seat to look. "It is a reflex. Her nervous system is starting to come back online. That is a very good sign, but she is not waking up. Not just yet. It could be hours. Her mind needs a chance to come to terms with what she endured. Sometimes, the body recovers faster than the mind will allow." Maria took this in, her thumb gently stroking her mother's hand in small, reassuring circles. "Is she going to remember what they did?" "Probably," Victor answered with gentle honesty. But memories tend to lose their sharp edges over time, especially when you have survived them. I will remember too, Maria said in a soft, determined voice, for the rest of my life. Ramon looked over at her, his expression as unreadable as ever. Yes, you will. Is that a bad thing? That will depend entirely on what you decide to do with that memory. Maria thought about this, her young mind grappling with ideas that most children are never forced to face. What am I supposed to do with it? You survive, you become stronger, and you make certain that no one can ever have that kind of control over you again. It was not a word of comfort. It was not a therapeutic platitude. It was the cold, hard pragmatism of a man who knew that trauma could either shatter a person or forge them into steel. And that choice, no matter how unfair, ultimately rested with the one who survived. We have arrived, Diego announced. He turned the car onto a private, tree-lined driveway that led toward a massive estate concealed behind high stone walls and wrought iron gates that swung open for them automatically. A full medical team was waiting for them near the entrance, 3 professionals dressed in surgical scrubs with a gurney and bags of equipment ready to go. The Mercedes came to a perfectly smooth stop. The doors opened in a coordinated motion, and Elena Smith, still unconscious but breathing more deeply now, was transferred into the care of hands that knew precisely how to bring her back from the brink. Maria moved to follow the gurney, but Ramon's hand on her shoulder stopped her gently. Let them do their work first. Give them 5 minutes. After that, you can be with her for as long as you need. Maria nodded, her eyes fixed on her mother as she was wheeled through a set of pristine white double doors. She was still alive. They had both made it through, and for now, that was more than enough. The safe house itself was a place of stark contrasts. It was sheer luxury built around a core of impenetrable security. It was elegance that served to hide a capacity for immense violence. Opulent crystal fixtures hung directly above a bank of surveillance screens. Polished marble floors shone under weapon displays concealed behind secret panels. This was the domain of men like Ramon Ortega, a place where business was conducted far from any official record or courtroom. Maria sat small in a massive leather chair, her feet, caked in mud, hovered inches above an expensive Persian rug. Someone had given her a cup of warm tea she could not bring herself to drink, and a heavy blanket she clutched around her shoulders like a shield. She could see through the wide open doorway into the next room, where medics worked with quiet urgency on her mother. Ramon stood near the window, a phone held tightly to his ear, his voice a low, steady command. Victor was somewhere else in the vastness of the house. Diego and Mateo stood guard outside, motionless as statues. Yes, Ramon spoke into the phone. I need absolute discretion. No police, no reports, no paper trail. He paused. Because those are my terms. He ended the call, the phone disappearing into his pocket as his focus settled entirely on Maria. The young girl looked back at him, her eyes holding the weight of things she should never have seen. She understood very little, but her trust was absolute. Your mother is stable, Ramon said, his voice softer than she expected. The doctors are tending to the cuts on her wrists. There will be scars, but she will recover. Maria gave a slow, deliberate nod. Can I be with her now? Very soon, they are almost finished. The door was thrown open. Victor strode in with a grim purpose, his face a thundercloud. He held a tablet in his hand, extending it toward Ramon without a single word. We have a serious problem. Ramon accepted the device, his gaze sweeping across the screen. An almost invisible tightening of his jaw was the only sign of the information he was absorbing. Show me everything. Victor tapped the screen once, and Maria watched Ramon's expression as he took in the new data. The air in the room grew instantly colder. When did this happen? Ramon asked, his voice sharp. It was while we were on our way here. Diego discovered them at the clearing right after we departed. They were fresh prints. He took pictures of everything before the medical crew arrived and disturbed the scene. Ramon returned the tablet, his mind already calculating possibilities and planning his response. He looked from Maria to Victor. Take her to her mother, and you will stay with both of them. Victor recognized the command for what it was, an act of protection, not a dismissal. He offered a hand to Maria. Come, little one. Your mom has been asking for you. A flicker of light returned to Maria's eyes. She is awake? Victor managed a small smile. Just barely, but she wants to see her daughter. The little girl slid from the huge chair and took Victor's hand, giving Ramon one last look over her shoulder before she vanished into the other room. Ramon stood in silence until he heard the distinct click of Elena's door shutting. Diego, he called out, his voice calm but carrying. The man materialized in the doorway in seconds, as if he had been anticipating the call. He had been. Show me exactly what you found. Diego produced his own phone, flicking through a gallery of images. He spoke with methodical calm. I circled back after we got Elena secured in the vehicle. I wanted to preserve the scene, just in case we needed proof later on. He presented the phone. Ramon took it, his eyes narrowing as he analyzed each photograph. In the pictures, the clearing lost its strange beauty and became a cold, clinical crime scene. The giant oak tree filled the frame, the severed rope still hanging from a thick branch like a grim warning. But the ground held the most important clues. There were dozens of boot prints. Some were older, smashed into the mud during the initial assault. But others were new, their tracks deep and clear, cutting a determined path across the clearing and leading away from the tree. These were not here when we first arrived, Ramon stated. It was not a question. No, sir. I am 100% certain of it. I swept the perimeter myself when we got there. These tracks were made after we were gone. Somebody came back for them. Ramon swiped to the next photograph. It was a close-up of the prints, with Diego's combat knife laid beside one for scale. The boots were large, with a heavy, aggressive tread. They were military-grade soles, the type worn by men who go looking for conflict and prepare for it. 4 distinct patterns, Diego explained. That means 4 different men. They came from the northeast, the same direction the first group of attackers ran. They went straight to the tree, probably saw the cut rope, and then they began to search. Yes, sir. My guess is they were looking for the bodies of their associates. When they found nothing, they came back together here. Diego swiped to another image, this one showing a cluster of overlapping prints right beside the oak's enormous trunk. They stood in this spot for several minutes. You can see how the earth is churned up, like they were having a disagreement. Ramon examined the picture, his tactical brain piecing together the sequence of events. 4 men returning to an empty scene. No struggle, no bodies, just a clearing and a cut rope. That would raise a lot of questions, and men with questions could become reckless and very dangerous. They followed our trail out, Ramon concluded in a low voice. Diego nodded, his face grim. They tracked us all the way back to the paved road. I found their prints near where we parked our vehicles. They would have seen our tire marks and known which direction we took. Did they continue to follow? It is impossible to know for sure. I lost their trail completely on the pavement. But sir, Diego paused, which was not like him at all. They know someone intervened. They know their entire operation was compromised, and now they are hunting for the person responsible. Ramon handed the phone back, his expression like stone. How many did we neutralize in the forest? 3 are confirmed. A 4th one got away during the first moments of the fight. He took off running before we had a chance to contain him. Can you describe him? Medium height, medium build. He was wearing a bright red jacket. He moved very fast. Mateo managed to wound him with a shot, but he reached a vehicle we hadn't seen. It sounded like a dirt bike. Ramon stood in thought for a long moment, weighing the new variables, calculating the increased risk. 4 men returning meant their initial team was bigger than he had thought. They were organized, they were coordinated, And they were not the kind of people who would accept a loss without retaliation. And now they are aware that someone stood against them. They will strike back, Ramon declared at last. Against whom? They have no idea who we are. They know a person cut Elena down. They know a person took her away from there. And they know enough to come searching. Ramon's gaze drifted to the closed door, behind which Maria and her mother were trying to feel safe. They will start checking the places she might go for help. Her apartment, her job, her friends. We have her here. She is under our protection now, but we cannot shelter her indefinitely. And they are the patient type. Ramon's jaw hardened with resolve. No. Waiting only gives them an advantage, time to organize and bring in more men. What is your plan, sir? Ramon met Diego's gaze, and his eyes held the cold certainty of a man who built an empire by acting decisively. We will return there tonight. We will find them before they have a chance to find us. Diego did not smile, but a look of grim satisfaction settled on his face. I will inform Mateo to prepare our full tactical gear. This is not going to be a negotiation. Understood. As Diego departed, Ramon moved back to the window, staring out at flawless gardens that concealed nothing more sinister than a high landscaping bill. The forest held the memory of what had been done in its shadows. And tonight, it would be forced to remember even more. The hunting cabin was located 3 miles northeast of the clearing. It was concealed behind a dense wall of pine trees, reachable only by a neglected dirt path. It was the sort of place where people went to vanish, whether by their own will or someone else's. A thin line of smoke drifted from a rusted chimney, a gray smudge against the fading light of the sky. Warm yellow light seeped through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. Inside, angry voices rose and fell, punctuated by the sharp sound of beer bottles being opened and the thud of furniture being kicked. Ramon watched all of this from the safety of the tree line, crouched in perfect stillness 50 yards away. Next to him, Diego swept the area with night vision binoculars, while Mateo moved silently to cover the rear exit. They had left Victor back at the secure house with one simple, critical order: protect Elena and Maria, no matter what happened. This was a different kind of task. This was work that demanded an entirely different level of concentration. 4 targets confirmed, Diego whispered, his breath a faint mist in the chilly air. All of them are armed. I can see 2 rifles. There are probably more weapons we cannot see. They are extremely agitated. There is a lot of pacing, a lot of shouting. Ramon observed the cabin with the patience of a predator. The building was old but constructed from thick, solid logs. It had very few windows, 1 main entrance, and a single back door. It was a defensible position if you were expecting an attack, but a perfect trap if you were not. They are afraid, Ramon noted quietly. They have good reason to be. They returned to that clearing and their friends were gone. Not just gone, but completely vanished. No signs of a fight, no bodies, nothing. That is far worse than discovering corpses. At least corpses provide answers. Through the gaps in the window shutters, Ramon could make out moving shadows, men walking back and forth, waving their arms. One of the shadows was noticeably larger than the others, and it dominated the room with its aggressive posture. That was the leader, the one who was likely making the decisions. We could burn them out of there, Diego offered in a low voice. A dry old cabin like that would ignite very quickly. Too much noise, too much attention. The smoke would be seen for miles. Ramon's focus never wavered from the building. We will walk right in. We will take control of the situation. We are going to make them understand the consequences of hanging innocent women from trees. Diego lowered his binoculars. You want to take them alive? I want them to provide answers first. And after that? Ramon gave no reply. He did not have to. Mateo's voice came through his earpiece, a soft crackle. I am in position. The back door is secure. No movement on this side at all. Ramon tapped his own earpiece. Hold your position until I give the signal. No one gets out. Copy that. Ramon checked his sidearm, a matte black pistol that felt like a natural part of his own hand. Diego did the same. A whole lot more chaos than this. Their actions were robotic and flawless. They had been through this before, though not frequently, because Ramon built his world on creating empires, not on dismantling petty operations. But there were times when a point had to be made with force. There were times the wilderness itself seemed to crave a sacrifice. On my count of 3, Ramon instructed. They flowed like shadows between the trees, covering the ground between them in mere moments. Ramon's method was always forward. No sneaking around, no delicate approach. He walked directly to the front door and drove his boot into it, striking with enough power to rip the rusted hinges halfway from the wooden frame. The door flew violently inward. Inside, 4 men scrambled to their feet, their hands instinctively going for guns that were already useless. Ramon crossed the threshold, his pistol held high and perfectly still. Diego was a single pace behind him, his weapon covering the right half of the room while Ramon controlled the left. "Stop," Ramon said, his voice a low command. The single word landed with more impact than a gunshot. All 4 men went completely still, their fingers frozen just inches from the rifles leaning against the walls or the handguns shoved into their belts. These were not soft men. They had scarred faces and cold expressions, the types who had carved out their lives in places where the law was a distant rumor. But they knew what death looked like when it kicked in their door. The biggest of them, clearly the one in charge, was standing beside a beat-up table littered with empty beer bottles and a spread-out map. He looked to be around 40, with a dense beard and a tattoo of a snake devouring its own tail on his left hand. It was the exact same mark Maria had described. His eyes went wide, not with recognition of Ramon's face, but of the archetype he represented. This was a professional, someone calm and utterly certain of his purpose. "Who in the hell are you?" the leader asked, but his voice lacked the confidence his words tried to project. "I am the man who took Elena Smith down from your tree," Ramon answered, his tone perfectly level. The warmth from the fireplace seemed to vanish from the cabin. The 4 men shot looks at one another, a storm of fear, confusion, and the slow dawn of terrible understanding passing between them. "That was none of your concern," the leader stated, his hand beginning a slow crawl toward the pistol at his side. Diego's gun adjusted by a millimeter. The motion was almost imperceptible, yet every man in the room saw it. The leader's hand froze in place. "You hanged a woman from a branch, and you forced her child to witness it," Ramon went on, his voice still a controlled whisper. "You made it the business of everyone in these woods. She had a debt to pay. To whom?" The leader's jaw muscles clenched and unclenched. He glanced at his 3 associates, one wearing a red bandana near the hearth, another, younger, with a poorly healed gash on his cheek sitting at the table, and an older man with gray streaks in his beard leaning on the far wall. Not one of them appeared ready to speak up. "I believe I asked you a question," Ramon said. This time, his voice held a new quality, an edge that made the cabin feel like it was shrinking. "To whom?" "Castellano," the leader finally forced the name out. "Victor Castellano. She was a waitress at his place, took money from the till. $3,000 over about 6 months. Ramon took a moment to absorb this information. Victor Castellano was a minor player, a man who ran protection schemes and backroom card games on the eastern edge of the territory. He was insignificant, but known for being cruel, the type of man who made up for his lack of genuine authority with displays of extreme brutality. "So Castellano sent you to set an example of her. He sent us to deliver a message. You do not steal from the family." "The family," Ramon echoed, a trace of something like dark humor touching his lips. "Victor Castellano is not a part of any family I acknowledge. He is a leech that preys on people who are too weak to defend themselves." "And who the hell are you to say that?" the leader demanded once more, his anger starting to boil over his fear. Ramon took one deliberate step into the room. Just a single step. It was enough to make all four of them flinch. I am the man who is about to explain something to you with perfect clarity, Ramon said. And you are going to pay attention, because your continued existence hinges on you understanding every word I am about to say. The cabin became so quiet, you could hear the fire consuming the logs in the hearth and the lonely whistle of the wind moving through the pines outside. You made a terrible mistake this evening, Ramon said. A final one. The man in the red bandana shifted his weight, his anxiety becoming obvious. Listen, man, we were just taking orders. You hung an innocent woman from a tree. Ramon's voice sliced through the pathetic excuse like it was nothing. You subjected a little girl to absolute terror. You stood there and you laughed about it. How could you possibly know that? Maria told me every single thing, every last detail, every awful word that you spoke. The men started exchanging nervous looks now. If the little girl had managed to talk, if she was still alive, if she had found her way to someone with the means to act, their situation was dire. The leader's expression hardened into a mask of defiance. Then you must know we were sent by somebody much bigger than us. If you kill us, Castellano will send people to find you. Ramon's face remained a blank slate. Let him come. The profound silence that followed his words felt like a steel cable being stretched to its breaking point, ready to snap at any second. The leader's face grew dark, his rage fighting a losing battle with the primal instinct that was screaming at him that he was standing at the brink of oblivion. You believe you can just come in here? I already have, Ramon cut him off, his voice flat. Now, you will answer what I ask. How many of you were there when you took Elena Smith? The leader's jaw was clamped shut. I don't have to tell you anything. Diego's weapon moved again, the barrel now aimed squarely at the man's heart. The intent was unmistakable. 7. The younger man with the scar suddenly blurted out, his voice thin and cracking. There were 7 of us in total. The leader shot him a look that could kill, but the information was already out. Ramon's gaze shifted to the young man. What are their names? I don't know all their names. Yes, you do. The young man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. He looked to his friends for any kind of support, but found none. He quickly decided that talking might give him a few more minutes of life. Me? My name is Tommy. That's Jake. He jerked his head toward the leader. The guy in red is Chris. The old guy is Pete. The other 3 who are not here are Vic, Danny, and Mitch. And where are Vic, Danny, and Mitch now? Ramon asked, even though he was certain he knew the answer. Silence fell on the room. It was heavy and filled with guilt. They never made it back from the woods, Jake finally admitted, his voice strained. You already know that, don't you? Whatever happened to them, they got precisely what they had coming, Ramon stated plainly. They were shown the same compassion they showed Elena Smith, which was absolutely none, Diego added from his position. Jake's hand made another twitchy move toward his gun. It was a purely reflexive action, not a plan, the panicked motion of a trapped animal. But Ramon was quicker than reflexes. His pistol roared a single time, the sound painfully loud inside the small cabin. The bullet struck the wooden table just 6 inches from Jake's hand, launching a spray of splinters into the air. Every person in the room froze solid. The next one will not miss, Ramon said, his voice as calm as if he had only been clearing his throat instead of discharging his weapon. All of you, sit down. For a long second, nobody complied. Then Pete, the older man by the wall, slowly eased himself down into a chair by the fireplace. Tommy went next, raising his hand slightly as a sign of surrender. Chris, wearing the red bandana, paused for a moment, but then collapsed onto a nearby stool. Jake alone stayed on his feet, his face a picture of defiance, even as raw fear showed in his eyes. Sit, Ramon said again. Or what? You are going to kill me? You plan on doing that no matter what. That is a possibility. But sitting down buys you a few more moments to argue why I should not. Jake's laugh was a harsh, bitter sound with no humor in it. You are not here to talk. You are here to tie up loose ends for someone. I am here, Ramon corrected him, because a small girl ran down a dirt road in her bare feet, screaming for anyone to help her mother. And when I located that mother hanging from a tree, with the rope biting deep into her wrists, I came to a conclusion about what kind of men should be allowed to walk away from a scene like that. He let his words hang in the air. You are not those men. The cabin was silent once more, the only sound being the crackle of the flames. Outside, the forest was completely swallowed by the night. Mateo's voice came through Ramon's earpiece, a barely audible whisper. Everything is still clear on my end, boss. There was no motion in the room. Jake finally took a seat, but his body was a tightly wound spring, rigid with tension. Castellano had given us a task. We completed it. That is the way of our world. Following a command does not erase your part in it, Ramon replied, his voice low and even. You had 100 different ways to deliver that message, but you chose the most brutal one available. You chose to employ terror. You chose to force a young child to witness her mother's agony. She had to see it, Jake retorted. That is the entire purpose of a message. You make it unforgettable. You make certain it leaves a scar. Then this will be a scar, Ramon said softly. Everything that happens from this moment on, this will be the message that truly endures. From his post by the window, Chris finally spoke, his voice trembling just enough to betray his fear. Look, we had no idea anyone would give a damn. Elena Smith is a nobody. She is just a waitress who got greedy. In our business, actions like that have consequences. In my business, Ramon countered, hanging women from trees has consequences of its own. Tommy, the youngest of the crew, could not hold his tongue any longer. We are sorry. All right, we can go. We will report to Castellano that the task is finished, that she is gone. Whatever you need from us, we will vanish. You will not see our faces again. Diego let out a dry sound, a laugh completely devoid of any humor or warmth. Ramon observed Tommy for a long, quiet moment. The kid was perhaps 25 years old. You could still see the fear in his eyes, a fear not yet replaced by the hardened cruelty that defined the others. Yet, he was there. He had taken part. Feeling regret is not the same thing as being innocent. Elena Smith is alive, Ramon stated. Her daughter is alive. They are now in my care, under my protection. This means the message that Castellano wanted you to send has failed in every possible way. Jake's face contorted with pure fury. Then he will simply dispatch another team. Do you honestly believe protecting two nobodies is worth starting a war with him? I am not in the business of starting wars, Ramon replied. I am in the business of ending them. He drew out his phone with his free hand, his weapon remaining perfectly steady on Jake. After a few quick taps, he angled the screen for all the men to see. It was a photograph. The image was grainy, taken from a security camera, showing Victor Castellano as he entered a restaurant in the center of town. The timestamp read, just 3 hours ago. Your boss is completely unaware of what transpired today, Ramon explained. He does not know that you failed your mission. He does not know that I have become involved. At this very moment, he is enjoying his dinner, making future plans, with no idea that his entire enterprise is on the verge of total collapse. You cannot get to Castellano, Jake said, though the certainty had vanished from his tone. He has connections everywhere, powerful protection, people who… Everyone has connections until they are cut, Ramon interrupted smoothly. Everyone believes they are untouchable until someone finally touches them. He put the phone away and stood a little straighter. This is what is going to happen next. I am going to present you with a choice, which is far more than you offered Elena Smith. The four of them waited, their breaths held in the suffocating silence. Option 1. You will tell me everything you know about Castellano's organization, his operating locations, his associates, where he hides his money, and who provides his protection. You will give me every last detail, and maybe, just maybe, you will be allowed to walk out of this place alive. And option 2? Pete asked, his voice strained from his position near the fireplace. Ramon's cold expression remained unchanged. There is no option two. Jake let out a bitter, hopeless laugh. So that is not a real choice then. Oh. It is more of a choice than you gave a woman who was begging for her life while her daughter was forced to watch, Ramon retorted. The weight of that truth settled in the room like a physical thing. Even Chris had to look away, a flicker of what might have been shame crossing his face. The clock is ticking, Diego murmured from the side. Tommy was the first to shatter. Castellano's main base is the Paradise Club on 7th. He has a warehouse in the industrial sector where he hosts illegal card games. And also, shut your mouth, Jake screamed, surging from his chair. Ramon's firearm tracked his movement without a flicker. Sit down now. We are finished either way. Can you not see that? If we talk, Castellano will have us killed. If we stay silent, you will kill us. There is no escape for us. There is always an escape, Ramon said. Sometimes the path is just much narrower than you would prefer. The sun was beginning to break when Ramon finally returned to the safe house, coloring the horizon with strokes of gold and pink that felt almost profane after the darkness of the night's events. Diego was behind the wheel, while Mateo sat in the back, cleaning his weapon with a focused, methodical calm. None of the men spoke a word. There was nothing left that needed to be said. The small cabin deep in the woods would not hear human voices again. The great forest had taken back its silence, and 4 men who had considered themselves untouchable had learned their final brutal lesson about consequences. Ramon had made his decision, the same one he always made when he found mercy and justice standing on opposite sides of a very clear line. Some lines are never meant to be crossed. Victor was waiting for them at the door. His face was a neutral mask, but his eyes held the questions he would not ask in front of the others. Ramon offered a very slight nod, just enough to convey that everything that needed to be done had been handled. Nothing more needed to be said. Status? Ramon asked in a low voice. Elena is awake and she is lucid. She has been asking about her daughter. Victor paused for a moment. And she has been asking about you. Ramon took off his suit jacket, noticing the smear of dirt on the sleeves and a small tear near the shoulder. He passed it to Diego, who took it and went to dispose of it where it would never be found. Some forms of evidence simply did not need to continue existing. Maria, who was sound asleep in the chair next to her mother's bed, refused to leave. She has not moved since you left. Ramon nodded, walking through the ornate hallway that led to the medical wing. His steps made no sound on the polished marble floors, a lifetime of practice making silence his natural state. He stopped just outside the partially open door, taking a moment to observe the scene before he entered. Elena Smith was propped up on a mound of pillows. Her wrists were covered in clean, white bandages that were a stark contrast against her pale skin. An intravenous drip was slowly feeding fluid into her left arm. One of the medical staff had washed and braided her dark hair. She appeared incredibly fragile, but she was alive. She was definitively, undeniably alive. Maria was curled up and sleeping in the large armchair that had been placed beside the bed. Victor's own suit jacket was still draped over her small body, serving as a makeshift blanket. Her face was finally peaceful in her sleep, the abject terror having at last released its grip on her features. One of her hands was stretched across the narrow space between the chair and the bed, her fingers loosely intertwined with her mother's. Elena's gaze found Ramon standing in the doorway. She did not flinch or look away. She simply watched him with a focused intensity, as if she were trying to understand how the man who had rescued her could be the same type of man capable of such necessary violence. Ramon entered the room without a sound and closed the door behind him, though he did not lock it. You never trap yourself inside a room that has no other exit. Mr. Ortega. Elena's voice was surprisingly firm. Mrs. Smith. Just Elena. She paused. Maria told me what happened. She told me what you did, and what you are doing now. Ramon moved to stand near the window, keeping a respectful distance. He was close enough to talk, but far enough to give her a sense of space. She never should have had to tell you anything. She is only a child. She is my child, and she is the reason I am alive, because she ran to you. She saved her own life by being courageous enough to ask for help, he corrected gently. I only happened to be there to hear her. Elena made a small sound, a noise that might have been a laugh if it did not cause her so much pain. You do not seem like the kind of man who ends up anywhere by accident. Ramon did not bother to deny it. The truth of it was far more complex. He had been on his way back from a meeting in the Northern Territory, choosing to take the back roads to avoid unwanted traffic and attention. The sudden fog, the deserted road, the precise timing. Some might have called it fate. He simply saw it as mathematics. He placed no faith in providence, but he always acknowledged the power of probability. The men who did this to you will not be coming back, Ramon said with finality. Elena's eyes searched his face, already knowing the answer. Because they are dead. It was a statement, not a question. Ramon did not confirm it, but he did not deny it either. His silence was her answer. Good, Elena whispered, and beneath her fragile state, there was a core of steel. I hope they suffered for what they did. They were made to understand their mistake before the end. Elena nodded her head slowly, absorbing his words. Her fingers instinctively tightened around Maria's hand, the unconscious gesture of a mother who had come terrifyingly close to losing her entire world. What is going to happen to us now? She asked. Maria told me that we are under your protection. But what are we being protected from, if those men are gone? They were working for someone else, a man named Victor Castellano. He sent them to make an example of you, all because of a debt he insisted you owed him. The color drained from Elena's face. $3,000. I did not take it. My register came up short 3 different times, and he accused me of theft. I begged him to let me pay it back, to work extra shifts, anything at all. But he just said that examples had to be made. Castellano will not be making examples of anyone, ever again. You are going to go after him next. It was not a question. I am going to have a conversation with him about changing his business practices. That is not a conversation, that is... Elena cut herself off, her eyes drifting to her daughter's sleeping face. Will Maria and I be safe here? Yes. How can you promise that? Because making sure people are safe is what I am very good at. Elena looked at him for a long time, at this dangerous man in his expensive clothes who had materialized out of the fog like a character from some dark legend, a monster who had arrived just in time to save them from other, lesser monsters. Why? She finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why would you help us? You do not know who we are. We are nobodies to a man like you. Ramon remained silent for a moment, thinking about how to answer a question he had already asked himself during the long drive back. Why did he stop the car? Why did he intervene without a moment's thought? He had built a powerful empire on carefully calculated risks, on cold and ruthless pragmatism, on strategic thinking. There was no room for mercy in that design. But then he had seen Maria's small face, the raw terror mixed with a sliver of hope, the desperate belief that someone, anyone in the world, would care enough to do something. My sister was 8 years old when she died, Ramon said quietly, the words feeling strange, surprising him as much as they did Elena. He almost never spoke of Sophia, especially not to strangers. Someone took her, and other people heard her, but nobody stopped them. Nobody wanted to get involved because they did not think a poor girl from nowhere was worth risking anything for. Elena's expression changed then, a wave of sad understanding washing over her eyes, a recognition that was all too common in its tragedy. Ramon's voice was low as he continued. I was only 14 years old. I was too young to make a difference, and far too weak to matter to anyone. He paused, the memory sharp. I made a promise to myself then. If I ever gained real power, I would use it in a completely different way. If I saw an innocent person being harmed, someone who was completely defenseless, I would be the one to step in and make it stop. Elena looked at him, realizing he had done just that. He had kept that promise. "When I am able," he added quietly. In her sleep, Maria shifted, her small voice murmuring something that was lost in the quiet room before she fell still again. The two adults watched the child for a long moment. Her childhood had survived an absolute nightmare, and she would undoubtedly carry the marks of it for the rest of her life. "Thank you," Elena whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "For stopping your car, for actually listening to my daughter, for giving me back to her." Ramon gave a single, sharp nod, visibly uncomfortable with her gratitude. He never did things for recognition, only the results ever mattered. "You both will stay here until you are fully healed," he stated, shifting back to practical matters. "My people will find new housing for you, somewhere far away where Castellano's network cannot possibly reach. We will provide new identification if it is necessary. You will have a fresh start." "We cannot afford—" she began, but he cut her off. "It is already handled, Mr. Ortega. It is handled," he repeated with an unwavering firmness that left no room for argument. "Consider it a payment for the information you can provide," he explained. "You were an employee at Castellano's club. You understand his operations, you know his daily patterns, and you are aware of his weaknesses. That kind of knowledge is extremely valuable intelligence." Elena immediately saw what he was doing. He was giving her a way to accept his help without feeling like a charity case, a way to maintain her dignity while he guaranteed her safety and her future. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I will tell you everything that I know." "Later," Ramon insisted. "First, you need to rest. You need to heal." He walked towards the door but stopped just before leaving. "Elena," he said, his voice serious, "what happened to you was not your fault. You did absolutely nothing to deserve it, and I promise you that the men responsible for this will never hurt another person again. And it will be because of you. It will be because they made the wrong choice when they decided to harm you." He was gone before she could even think of a response, closing the door softly behind him. Victor was waiting for him in the hallway, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression impossible to read. "Castellano?" Victor asked simply. "Tomorrow night," Ramon commanded. "I need full surveillance on him, a complete schedule of his movements. I want to know every single person he meets with. When I go to visit him, I need him to be completely isolated. Do you understand?" Victor paused for a moment. "Boss, word about what happened at the cabin is going to spread." "Let it," Ramon replied without hesitation. 3 days passed inside the safe house, a period where time itself seemed to be suspended. Elena began to regain her strength. The healthy color slowly returned to her face, and the constant trembling in her hands began to fade away. The doctors gradually lowered her dosage of pain medication. They encouraged her to take short walks around the room, and they checked on her healing wounds with nods of clear satisfaction. Throughout it all, Maria refused to stray far from her mother's side. She would jolt awake from terrible nightmares, gasping for air, her small hands reaching out in the pitch darkness until her fingers brushed against Elena's. Only then would she breathe a sigh of relief, remembering that she was finally safe, and curl back up to sleep. Ramon visited them twice each day, once in the morning and once in the evening. His check-ins were always brief, never lasting for more than 5 minutes. He would inquire about Elena's recovery, confirm that Maria had everything a child could possibly need, and then he would vanish back into the demanding business that consumed his life. He never lingered long enough for any sense of comfort to develop between them, never allowing familiarity to break down the necessary wall he kept between the savior and the saved. On the evening of the third day, Elena requested to speak with him alone. Victor gently guided Maria to the kitchen to have some dinner, leaving the mother and her potential benefactor by themselves in the sterile medical room that had become Elena's entire world. She was now able to sit upright without any assistance, her bandaged wrists resting on her lap, looking like two white flags of surrender to a fate that had been far beyond her control. "I told Victor absolutely everything I know about Castellano," Elena stated, wasting no time on pleasantries. His daily schedule, his important contacts, the names of the people he pays to look the other way, the places where he feels the most secure. Everything. Ramon nodded slowly. I am aware. Victor gave me a full briefing. Then you have what you came for, she said. You do not need to keep us here anymore. Her tone was not accusatory. It was simply a statement of fact from a woman who had learned the hard way that a person's value was often determined by their usefulness. You are not here because you are useful to me, Ramon answered in a quiet voice. You are here because you are still healing. We cannot stay here forever, Elena insisted. This is not our world. We do not belong in grand houses with marble floors and armed guards watching every door. She gestured vaguely at the opulent luxury that surrounded them. This life. So where do you belong? He asked. The question seemed to take her by surprise. I do not know anymore, she admitted. Certainly not in my old apartment. Castellano knows exactly where that is. Not at the diner where I worked for the same reason. Right now, nowhere feels safe. That is precisely why you will be going somewhere completely new, he explained. You will go somewhere Castellano's influence is non-existent. And how will we live? She challenged. I am a waitress with only a high school education and a daughter who depends on me for everything. Fresh starts cost money, money that I do not have. Ramon had already anticipated this part of the conversation. Victor has already secured employment for you, he said. It is a restaurant management position with a good salary and full benefits. The job is in a small, quiet city about 3 hours north of here. Maria's enrollment in a new school has been taken care of. The first and last month's rent on a new apartment has already been paid. Elena just stared at him, completely stunned. Why would you do all of this? Because letting you survive only to struggle to make ends meet is not truly saving you, he replied. But we are strangers. You do not owe us anything. I do not operate in terms of debts and favors, Ramon interrupted her. I think in terms of completion. I started something important when I cut you down from that tree. And so, it was over. Elena's eyes were bright with unshed moisture, but no tears would fall. She had exhausted her supply of them over the last few dreadful days. But what about Castellano? What happens if he learns we are still alive? What if he finds out you helped us? He is not going to discover anything. The cold certainty in Ramon's tone gave Elena a reason to pause. Are you actually going to do it? I plan to have a discussion with him, one where I suggest he rethinks his life's priorities. The outcome of that meeting will be determined entirely by his ability to listen. Maria asked me something. Elena's voice was barely a whisper, lost in thought. She asked if you were a good man or a bad one. I could not find the words to answer her. And what was your reply? I told her that you were the one who saved us. I said that sometimes, that is the only thing that truly counts. Ramon processed her words. Good and bad were fuzzy concepts, luxuries for people who had the privilege of observing violence from a safe distance. He had stopped believing in such simple moral labels on the day that Sophia died. Now there was only action and consequence, a chain of cause and effect. Your daughter has immense courage, he said after a moment. She ran directly into a dangerous situation just to save you. That kind of bravery is exceptionally rare. She should never have been forced to be brave. Her biggest concern should be about her schoolwork, her friends, and the typical troubles of an 8-year-old girl. Elena's voice trembled and then broke. I let her down. You both made it through. That is the opposite of failure. But I was the one who put her into that situation. It was my debt. They were my choices. They were Castellano's choices, Ramon corrected her with unyielding firmness. It was his decision to escalate things. It was his command to make an example out of you. You were not the one who hung yourself from that tree. You did not inflict that trauma upon your daughter. He did that. Elena took this in, wanting desperately to believe him, fighting against the crushing weight of a mother's guilt that screamed she should have shielded Maria from ever witnessing such a nightmare. "When can we go?" she asked softly. "Whenever you feel you are ready. Perhaps in a few more days." The medical staff wants to be absolutely sure that no infection develops. They need to know you can manage without constant medical supervision. And after that, we just vanish? We start a new life as if none of this ever took place. "You do not forget," he corrected her. "You do not pretend it did not happen. But you build something new on top of the old foundation anyway. That is what survival truly looks like." The sound of Maria's laughter suddenly drifted in from the kitchen, genuine and bright. It was the sound of a child remembering how to be a child again. Both adults instinctively turned toward the sound, like plants leaning toward the sun. "She likes Victor," Elena said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "She follows him everywhere, asking him endless questions. He is surprisingly patient with her." "Victor has children of his own," Ramon explained. "Two daughters. He understands." "Does he understand what you do?" Elena asked, her eyes searching his. "What you are?" Ramon met her gaze directly. "He understands that this world is filled with shadows, and that sometimes the only thing that can stop a monster is someone who is willing to be even more monstrous." "Is that what you are?" she asked softly. "A monster?" "I am what the situation requires me to be." Elena studied him for a long moment. This enigmatic man had crashed into the worst moment of her life and had somehow become the very axis on which her survival now spun. She wanted to understand him, to place him into a neat category, to make sense of a person who so clearly existed outside the lines of conventional morality. But perhaps understanding was not what was necessary. Perhaps simple acceptance was more than enough. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "Whatever you are, whatever happens next, thank you for stopping your car. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my daughter when you could have just as easily driven away." Ramon rose to his feet, preparing to leave. He had already stayed much longer than he had intended and had allowed for more conversation than was strategically wise. Attachment always complicated things. Maintaining distance was what kept situations clean and manageable. "Maria ran to me because she had no other choice," he said. "But she was right to trust her instincts. Some people are worth saving, and some people are worth the considerable risk that comes with saving them." Ramon paused at the door. "Yes." He left before Elena could say anything more, before her gratitude could turn into an expectation, before an act of mercy could transform into a real relationship. In the hallway, Maria nearly ran straight into him, with Victor following close behind, wearing an apologetic expression. "Mr. Ortega!" Maria's face immediately lit up with pure, uncomplicated joy. "Victor taught me how to play a new card game," she announced proudly. "I won 3 times in a row." "He probably let you win," Ramon suggested. "He did not," Maria protested, before glancing uncertainly back at Victor, who maintained a perfectly neutral expression. For a brief moment, Ramon almost smiled. Almost. Instead, he placed a hand gently on Maria's shoulder, the closest he would allow himself to come to a gesture of affection. "You take care of your mother," he said. "I will," she promised. "Are you leaving for good now, or will you come back?" Ramon looked down at this brave, traumatized little girl who had run through the fog and her own terror to save her mother, a child who had placed all her faith in the mercy of a complete stranger and had been proven right. "I will come back," he promised her. It was far more than he usually gave, more of a commitment than he ever should have made. But some promises, once they are spoken, simply cannot be unmade. The forest road looked entirely different in the bright light of day. It was less ominous, less otherworldly. It was just a simple stretch of asphalt cutting a path through ordinary trees under an ordinary sky. The fog had completely burned away, leaving everything behind it feeling sharp and clear, and strangely new. Ramon leaned against his Mercedes, the powerful engine humming quietly behind him. Inside the car, Diego and Mateo sat in silence, affording him this moment of solitude. Victor had remained at the safe house, watching over Elena and Maria, upholding the strict security that had become their normal routine this past week. Just 1 week. That was all it had been since a small girl had appeared out of the morning fog and altered the course of several lives with 6 terrible words. They hung my mom on a tree. Ramon glanced toward the dense line of trees where they had first walked into the forest. The path was still visible if one knew precisely where to search, marked by trampled ferns and a few snapped branches, yet nature was already working to reclaim it, diligently erasing any sign that something unnatural had happened there. The woods held on to their secrets. Victor Castellano would now hold on to his as well, on a permanent basis. The conversation Ramon had mentioned took place 2 nights before, deep in a back room of the Paradise Club. It had been very brief. The talk was direct, and it ended with Castellano reaching a crystal-clear understanding of how his entire operation would be changing, or more accurately, how it would be ceasing to exist. The club was now closed, its doors locked and its halls silent. Castellano's whole network had crumbled like a tower of cards once his hand was removed. The very people he had once intimidated were now quietly celebrating their newfound freedom. The local authorities did not ask a single question regarding his abrupt disappearance. Some people's absences just make a neighborhood a better place to live. Maria and Elena were departing today. Victor was assigned to drive them to their new residence, assist them in getting settled, and confirm they possessed everything they needed to start their lives over. Ramon decided he would not be present for the farewell. Goodbyes had a way of forging attachments, and attachments were a source of complications. He had already said everything that needed to be said. The rest was simply a matter of execution. His phone vibrated. It was a text from Victor. "They are asking where you are." Ramon typed his response. "Tell them I was called away on business. Tell them to stay safe." He waited for a moment. Another message arrived. "Maria says thank you. Elena says she will never forget what you did." Ramon slid the phone into his pocket and did not reply. Forgetting was impossible. People never forget the moments that shatter them or the moments that save them. Elena and Maria would be carrying this entire experience with them for the rest of their lives. The trauma and the deliverance, the absolute horror and the unexpected mercy, were now woven together so tightly that one could never be fully untangled from the other. That was the true burden of survival. You had to carry it all. A second car, a plain sedan, pulled up behind Ramon's Mercedes, driven by one of his trusted associates. The woman at the wheel gave a respectful nod. She had already been given her instructions and understood her task completely. She would monitor the road. She would watch for any person showing an unusual amount of interest in this specific area. She would report back on anything that seemed out of place. The forest was going to be under surveillance for the next month, just to be absolutely certain. Ramon got back into his own car, settling into the rear seat. Diego's eyes met his in the rearview mirror. "Back to the city, boss?" "Yes." The Mercedes accelerated smoothly, leaving the quiet forest road far behind. Ramon stared through the back window, watching it shrink into the distance. It was a simple stretch of pavement where a world had ended and a new one had begun. He had rescued 2 lives, ended the lives of several others, and completely dismantled a small criminal enterprise. He had also created a minor power vacuum that he knew someone else would eventually rush to fill. The world always keeps spinning. "That little girl is going to be all right," Diego said, his voice low. It was not quite a question, but it was not quite a declaration either. "She is tough. She is tougher than any child should ever have to be." Sounds like someone else I know. Ramon offered no reply to the remark. Drawing parallels between his own childhood and Maria's was understandable but ultimately flawed. When Sophia had died, he had nobody to run to for help. There was no stranger who emerged from the mist to offer him mercy and protection. He had been utterly alone. Maria was not, and that fact made all the difference in the world. The city skyline began to appear on the horizon. It was a landscape of steel and glass, filled with 1,000 problems that were all waiting for Ramon's attention. Business does not stop for acts of kindness. Empires demand constant supervision. So many people relied on his judgment, his authority, and his willingness to do the things that other people could not bring themselves to do. But as the Mercedes smoothly merged with the highway traffic and the forest finally vanished from view, Ramon felt an unfamiliar sensation settle deep within his chest. It was not exactly satisfaction, and it was not quite peace, but it was something very close to both. He had fulfilled a silent promise he made to his 14-year-old self. He had seen a defenseless person being hurt, someone who mattered deeply even if the world acted like she did not, and he had made it stop. Sophia would never know about this, but it still felt important that he had tried. His phone buzzed once more, displaying a picture sent from Victor. It showed Maria and Elena standing outside their new apartment building. Maria was beaming with a huge grin, while Elena offered a smile filled with fragile hope. The little girl was holding up a sheet of paper with large, neatly drawn letters that read, "Thank you, Mr. Ortega." Ramon looked at the photograph for a long time, saved it to his phone's memory, and then powered the device completely off. Some moments did not require a response. They only needed to be allowed to exist. "Diego," Ramon said softly. "Yes, boss?" "If anyone, at any time, asks you what took place on that forest road, the answer is that nothing happened. We were never there." "Understood." The Mercedes carried them deeper and deeper into the city, returning them to a world of strategic calculations and controlled violence, a world of power that was maintained by reputation and methodical brutality. Ramon would go back to being the man he had always been, a person who was feared, respected, and deliberately avoided by anyone with common sense. Yet somewhere 3 hours to the north, a little girl would now have the chance to grow up knowing that once, when it mattered more than anything, a dangerous stranger had chosen to show mercy instead of indifference, and her mother would be alive to watch her do it. That was enough. The forest road they left behind was now empty, quietly awaiting the next person to travel it, the next story to unfold. The old oak tree still stood there, its massive branches reaching wide. The marks from the rope were still there, visible if you knew to look for them. But the horror itself was gone. The act of cruelty had received its answer. The balance of things, as imperfect as it was, had been restored. The road held the memory of everything. It always would. But a memory without a consequence is just another piece of history. And Ramon knew that history is always written by those who manage to survive. Elena and Maria Smith had survived. That was the only part of this history that was important. Thank you for following this story all the way to its conclusion. Remember, true power is not about fear or control. It is about what you choose to do when someone weaker needs you. One decision, one moment of compassion, can rewrite someone's entire future. Never look away when you have the power to help. If this story moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this message today. Subscribe if you have not already, so you never miss a story like this one. And before you go, drop a comment below and rate this story from 1 to 10. I read every single one, and your words are what keep these stories coming. Now go ahead and tap the next video on your screen, because another powerful journey is waiting for you. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories and lasting lessons.